Millionaire falls in love at first sight with the bridesmaid who was late to his friend's wedding. Before watching the video, please leave a like and subscribe to support the channel. The hallway of the Grand Meridian Hotel echoed with the frantic click of heels and the rustle of satin as Lena Whitmore darted through the marble corridor, her breath shallow, her heart racing. Her pale blue bridesmaid dress trailed behind her like a wave caught in the wind, and the tiny clutch she gripped in one hand bounced wildly with every step. Of all the days for her to be late, her best friend's wedding, no less, today had to be it. The universe, it seemed, had conspired against her from the moment she woke. First, her alarm clock failed her. Then, the taxi she ordered never showed. A replacement arrived late, and the driver didn't understand the meaning of urgency. And just when she thought she might finally make it on time, a near miss with a reckless delivery van outside the hotel had her stumbling into the lobby with her heart thudding against her ribs. But none of that compared to the elevator. It was full, of course it was, and rather than wait, Lena made the fateful decision to run up 6 flights of stairs in heels she now regretted ever purchasing. Her mind raced faster than her feet. I just have to get inside the ballroom. Just slip in, smile, and act like I wasn't almost mowed down by life itself. She muttered apologies to bewildered guests as she darted past them, her cheeks already flushed with embarrassment and effort. She could hear the muffled murmur of guests settling inside the ceremony room. A soft piano melody floating through the air. The wedding was starting. Panic twisted in her chest. Her best friend, Caroline, would kill her. And then it happened. Lena turned the corner sharply, and her world came to a full stop. She didn't see him. Not until she slammed into someone, solid and unmoving. Her bouquet flew into the air like a startled bird. Her purse hit the floor with a dull thud. Her heel slipped. Her body pitched forward, heading straight for the expensive marble floor, until 2 strong hands caught her at the waist, steadying her with a firm grip. For a split second, the world fell quiet. All Lena could hear was the hammering of her heart in her chest and the soft, expensive scent of cologne drifting around her like fog. Her arms rested awkwardly against the stranger's broad chest, and for one dizzying moment, she forgot everything. Why she was rushing, where she was supposed to be, even her own name. I really hope I didn't just barrel over someone's grandfather, she mumbled, cheeks burning as she tried to straighten up. A deep, composed voice replied with a hint of amusement. I'm definitely not someone's grandfather, at least not yet. Lena blinked and then looked up. Her breath caught. He was tall, far taller than her even in heels. Dark, wavy hair that looked like it had been effortlessly styled. Piercing gray-blue eyes that seemed to study her like a puzzle, and a face so devastatingly handsome that she half suspected she'd hit her head. He was wearing a custom-tailored suit that fit him like it had been sewn onto him, and everything about him screamed power, wealth, and absolute control. You're late, he said, a slight tilt of his head, making the statement sound more like an observation than a rebuke. Lena's eyes widened. Great. Not only did I nearly give him a concussion, now he's Captain Obvious. Thank you. Any other brilliant insights you'd like to share? She said, brushing her hair from her face, trying to mask her mortification with sarcasm. The corner of his lips twitched. She tried to pull away, but immediately felt a sharp tug. Glancing down, her stomach dropped. Her heel had caught on the hem of her own dress. Of course. I'm actually stuck, she muttered under her breath, bending to assess the damage. Before she could make a further fool of herself, he crouched down with fluid ease and freed the fabric with one swift motion. There. You may now continue your suicide mission in stilettos, he said, rising with calm poise. Lena gritted her teeth. I was already on my way before you stepped into my path. He smirked. I hope you have life insurance. At this pace, you won't make it to the bouquet toss. And just like that, he stepped aside. Lena snatched her purse, nodded stiffly, and practically sprinted toward the ballroom. But even as the door closed behind her and she joined the bridesmaids in their stiff line, one thought pulsed through her mind like a drumbeat. Don't look back. Don't look back at him. She tried. She really did. She tried to focus on Caroline's serene smile, on the vows being whispered with love, on the delicate lace of the bride's gown, but her eyes betrayed her. Again and again they found him. There he was, sitting among the groomsmen, his posture relaxed, his eyes, those sharp, knowing eyes still fixed on her, watching her. Not in a casual way, not in a predatory way either, but as if he had seen something worth remembering. "Who is that?" Lena whispered to the bridesmaid beside her, nodding toward him without shifting too much. Her friend leaned over and whispered, "That's Colton Reyes, CEO of Reyes Capital. He's one of the wealthiest men in the country and the groom's longtime business partner." Lena's stomach sank. Of course he is. And in that moment, a strange feeling crept up inside her. Something between dread and curiosity, between panic and anticipation. Because somehow, in the middle of a day where everything had gone wrong, something felt like it had just begun. The ballroom glowed like a dream, golden chandeliers hanging like floating stars, soft candlelight flickering on every table, and the hush of anticipation hovering like a held breath. Rows of guests sat turned toward the aisle, waiting for the ceremony to begin. But among all the elegance, amid the hush and the whispers and the rustle of silk and tulle, Lena Whitmore's heart was beating so loudly she was certain someone would hear it. She had made it. Late, breathless, humiliated, but she had made it. Slipping into position beside the other bridesmaids, Lena tried to compose herself. She fixed her bouquet, tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, and hoped Caroline, her best friend and the radiant bride, would forgive her for arriving at the very last second. But the moment Lena lifted her gaze, all her thoughts scattered like leaves in the wind. There he was, Colton Reyes, seated in the first row beside the groom. Still in that sleek black suit, still wearing that unreadable expression. It was a face that belonged on the cover of a magazine. Sharp lines, storm gray eyes, a mouth that seemed like it rarely smiled but somehow almost had when he spoke to her in the hallway. He wasn't looking at the bride. He wasn't watching the groom. He was watching her. And not in passing. No, it was intentional, unflinching. A quiet, steady gaze that made her fingers tighten around the bouquet and her breath catch in her throat. It was as though time had slowed, as though the thousands of moments that had brought them to this exact point in time were leading to this silent conversation between two strangers who had collided not just in body, but in something deeper. And Lena felt it. She felt it in the center of her chest. She turned away quickly, pretending to adjust her dress. "Don't look back. Just breathe. It's nothing, just a fluke. A weird moment with a rich stranger you'll never see again. Let it go, Lena." But her heart refused to obey logic. Her skin still burned where he'd held her waist, steadying her after that fall. And worse, she could still smell him, like clean air before a storm, in something rich she couldn't name. "Stop playing with your hair," one of the bridesmaids whispered beside her. "You've been doing it for 5 minutes." Lena jolted. "Have I?" "Yes, and he's still staring." Lena's eyes snapped back to Colton before she could stop herself. He didn't look away, not even a flinch. His head tilted ever so slightly, his gaze sharp and curious, as if he were reading a page she hadn't written yet. And for a man who likely made million-dollar decisions with a single phone call, he didn't seem to be in any rush to look anywhere else. She turned away again, her stomach twisting. "Why would a man like that be watching someone like me?" she muttered under her breath. Her friend shrugged. "Maybe he likes puzzles." Lena let out a quiet laugh, trying to ease the tightness in her chest, but it didn't work. Because this didn't feel like curiosity. It felt like fate tapping its finger against her shoulder, whispering, "Pay attention." And still, she tried. She really did. When Caroline walked down the aisle in a dress that shimmered like a promise, Lena focused on her friend's glowing smile. She focused on the vows, the trembling voices, the love so palpable it made her throat tighten. She reminded herself why she was there. To support the woman who had stood by her during every heartbreak, every disappointment, every hopeless Monday. But still, she felt him. That stare, that energy, like the pull of gravity towards something she didn't yet understand. And every time she dared glance in his direction, Colton Reyes was still watching. Not arrogantly, not flirtatiously, but as if she'd surprised him. As if he didn't know what to make of the fact that someone like her, late, clumsy, ordinary, had left a mark. When the couple finally kissed, the crowd erupted in soft cheers. Lena clapped along with everyone else, smiling through the emotion in her chest. She was happy for her friend. So happy. But a sliver of her mind, just one tiny piece, wondered what it would be like to be kissed like that, loved like that, looked at like she was the only one in the room. Then she felt it again, a presence. She turned slowly this time, and there he was standing now, Colton, still looking at her. And this time he smiled, not a smirk, not a polite smile for appearances, but a small, real one, the kind that said everything without saying anything. And Lena, she smiled back, just barely, because something inside her whispered, this isn't over, not by a long shot. Dear listener, have you ever felt that spark, that moment when time forgets how to move and the world blurs around just one person? Maybe it happened on a train, maybe at a cafe, maybe you were too afraid to chase it, or maybe it changed your life. In this story for Lena Whitmore, it was only the beginning. What would come next was more than attraction. It would be a story of tension and restraint, of two people who shouldn't have fit, but somehow couldn't pull away. Because some connections don't follow logic. Some loves start not with a kiss or a conversation, but with a glance that lingers just a little too long. And as our story unfolds, dear listener, you'll see how that glance turned into late-night conversations, stormy arguments in empty offices, unspoken words in crowded rooms, and ultimately into something Lena never believed was meant for her. But that's for another moment. For now, let this image stay with you, a bride in white, a crowd full of strangers, and in the midst of it all, a bridesmaid and a billionaire watching each other like they'd met before in another life. The music had just begun to swell across the ballroom, a soft, elegant melody that floated like champagne bubbles in the air. But Lena Whitmore barely noticed it. She was too busy trying to hold herself together, emotionally and physically, as she weaved through polished tables and clinking glasses, praying she wouldn't trip again. The ceremony had ended, and the guests had flooded into the reception space, all glowing with joy and wine. But Lena felt like she was still catching her breath. Her heels pinched at her toes, the hem of her dress had already snagged twice, and she was beginning to wonder if the universe simply had a vendetta against her today. It was supposed to be a beautiful day. It was a beautiful day for everyone but her. She needed a drink, not to celebrate, but to forget. It wasn't just that she'd shown up late to her best friend's wedding, or that she'd made an accidental spectacle of herself crashing into a stranger just minutes before the ceremony. It wasn't even the way she had stumbled into her place beside the other bridesmaids, like a frazzled extra in someone else's love story. No, it was deeper than that. Lena had barely slept in weeks. Her architecture firm had laid off half its staff a month ago, and she was barely clinging to her job. Her apartment lease was expiring next month, and she still didn't know where she'd go next. She had no savings, no backup plan, and no family to fall back on. The only thing steady in her life was Caroline, her best friend, now a beautiful bride. So of course she had shown up today, no matter how much the universe tried to stop her. Even if it meant wearing borrowed heels and a dress she couldn't afford. Even if it meant swallowing the hollow ache of loneliness. With that thought lingering too heavily in her chest, Lena reached out to grab a glass of wine from a passing server, eager to drown her unease in at least a sip of Merlot. But fate, once again, had other plans. As she turned, her shoulder clipped someone, a wall, a tree, a person, and in that half-second of chaos, the full glass of red wine tipped forward like a waterfall in slow motion. She gasped. The wine splashed against the pristine black fabric of a tailored suit. A deep, blooming stain spread like ink on expensive parchment. Lena's breath caught in her throat. "Oh my God," she whispered, frozen in horror. "Tell me this didn't just happen." The man looked down at his shirt, then back up at her. And there he was, the man from the hallway, Colton Reyes. His expression was unreadable, but she braced herself for anger. Maybe even humiliation. After all, billionaires didn't exactly take kindly to being doused in wine by clumsy strangers. But instead of yelling, he slowly removed his jacket, folded it neatly over his arm, and began to roll up his sleeves with calm precision. "It happened," he said, his voice low and maddeningly even. "But I'll survive." I'll get napkins," Lena stammered. "Maybe some club soda. Wait, should I blot it? Do people blot suits, or is that only for carpet?" "Relax," he said gently. "It's just wine." She blinked, stunned. You're Not mad? He glanced at her. Should I be? Lena swallowed. I just destroyed your suit. It's dry cleanable. And besides, his eyes flicked to hers, steady and unreadable. I've survived worse things than red wine. That caught her off guard. There was something in his tone, something slightly sad and far more human than she expected. Still, she stepped back. I'm so sorry, I should go. Really, I'm just a walking disaster today. And clearly you've had enough of my... Join me, he said suddenly, cutting her off. She blinked. Excuse me? He nodded toward the bar. One drink. Unless you're afraid I'll throw another suit at you. Lena narrowed her eyes. Is this pity? Hardly. More like curiosity. His voice was low, like it didn't care what the rest of the world thought. Surprise me. Lena hesitated. Every fiber of her self-preservation screamed that this was a bad idea. He was powerful, rich, controlled. Everything she wasn't. Everything she had no business getting close to. But somewhere beneath the self-doubt and embarrassment, curiosity began to flicker. And perhaps even something warmer than that. She nodded. Okay, but I'm picking the drinks. He offered a half smile. Deal. They made their way to the bar. The air was quieter here, the crowd's hum fading behind them. Lena slid onto a stool and ordered 2 shots of whiskey, something bold enough to match the mood. Colton raised an eyebrow. Whiskey? You expected a fruit cocktail? She asked. I expected you to surprise me, and you did. Lena smirked, hiding the butterflies in her stomach. What about you, Mr. Reyes? What's a high-powered CEO doing at a wedding where he barely knows the guests? He lifted his glass and swirled it. I'm the groom's best man. She blinked. You don't seem like the best man type. I'm full of surprises, he said, then added, what about you? Besides terrorizing tuxedos, what's your story? Lena let out a breath. I'm an architect, or at least I was. These days, I'm just trying to stay employed long enough to pay next month's rent. His gaze softened, and she hated how exposed that made her feel. Tough year? She laughed bitterly. Tri-decade. For a moment, he didn't speak. He just studied her, and unlike the glances of men who ogled or judged or dismissed her, his gaze felt different, quiet, penetrating, as if he wanted to understand her, not consume her. Have you always wanted to be an architect? He asked softly. Lena looked down at her glass. Yeah, ever since I was a kid, I used to build tiny houses out of cereal boxes and tape. My dad used to tell me I could build a whole city if I wanted. Colton's brow lifted. Used to? She nodded, her throat tight. He died a few years ago. Cancer. It was fast. I haven't really built much since then. Silence stretched between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. I'm sorry, he said after a moment. She nodded. It's okay. You learn to move forward. You don't get to pause life just because you're grieving. Colton swirled the amber liquid in his glass. No, you don't. There was a pause, then he turned to face her fully. Lena, I don't know what kind of day you've had. Disastrous. But I'm glad you ran into me. She blinked. Seriously? He shrugged. I meet 100 people a week, CEOs, board members, influencers, and I forget them all by morning. But you, his eyes found hers. You made an impression. She was silent, not because she didn't believe him, but because something in her chest hurt. That ache you get when someone finally sees you after you've spent years feeling invisible. She downed the rest of her whiskey, trying to stop the trembling in her hands. Mr. Reyes. Colton, he corrected gently. Colton. She took a shaky breath. Whatever this is, it doesn't make sense. You're you, and I'm just... Eupterio, he said, finishing her sentence. And that's exactly why I'm still here. She laughed softly, tears unexpectedly pricking her eyes. You're either lying or just very, very bored. Colton leaned closer, lowering his voice. I don't lie, and I'm never bored when I'm challenged. Their eyes met again, and this time Lena didn't look away. I should get back to the bride, she whispered, voice trembling. He nodded. Then go. She stood slowly, heart pounding. But before she turned, Colton added, Lena? She glanced back. This won't be the last time we talk. She didn't answer. She just nodded and walked away, her footsteps light but her heart suddenly heavy, because somewhere deep inside her, she knew he was right. The ballroom was humming softly in the background. Distant laughter, the clinking of glasses, the rustle of silk dresses and polished shoes. But Lena Whitmore barely noticed any of it. The moment she sat at the bar with Colton Reyes, the rest of the world seemed to slip into silence. It wasn't the drink. It wasn't the music. It was him. This man with ice-gray eyes and the kind of stillness that didn't just settle into a room, it claimed it. He sat beside her, elbows resting casually on the edge of the bar, sleeves rolled up after the wine incident. His shirt slightly wrinkled from their collision, and yet he looked effortlessly composed, like nothing ever fazed him. Not the stain, not the fall, not the late, clumsy bridesmaid sitting beside him. And Lena couldn't figure out why he was still talking to her. "So," she said, wrapping her fingers around the small glass of whiskey in front of her, "how does a man like you end up at a wedding like this? Don't you usually go to events with red carpets and security details?" He smirked lightly, but his eyes didn't waver. "I'm the best man, childhood friend of the groom." "Of course," she muttered. "You probably own half the hotel, too." He let out a soft, amused breath. "Only the parking structure." She snorted into her glass, caught off guard by the dry humor. "I don't know if you're serious." "I like to keep people guessing," he said, and then turned his attention more fully toward her. "What about you, Lena? How does a disaster-prone architect with anxiety in her eyes end up knocking over a billionaire in a hotel hallway?" She laughed, really laughed, and it caught her off guard. She hadn't laughed like that in weeks, months maybe. "That's the question of the year," she said. "I was supposed to help with the decorations, do my hair, make a good impression. But instead, the universe gave me a late taxi, a broken elevator, and shoes that are currently cutting off circulation to my toes." He looked down at her feet. "You wore those voluntarily?" "They look cute in the box." He chuckled, and Lena blinked. Colton Reyes was laughing. Not the polite, rehearsed laugh of someone used to cocktail parties and gala toasts, but something real, something warm. It made her chest tighten unexpectedly. And then a silence fell between them. Not the awkward kind, not the uncomfortable kind, but the kind where you realize that somehow the air between you has shifted. Lena stared at her drink. "You know," she said softly, "I almost didn't come today." He glanced over, quiet now. "I've been overwhelmed lately," she continued. "Work's been a mess. Finances, too. I didn't feel like I had the right to show up at something so beautiful when my life's been falling apart. But Caroline, my best friend, the bride, she begged me, said she needed me there. So I came." She looked up, her eyes tired but open. "And then I spilled wine on a millionaire and tripped over my own dress. So, great start." But instead of laughing, Colton was watching her intently. Not judging, not pitying, just listening. "You ever feel like you're stuck between who you are and who you're supposed to be?" Lena asked quietly. "Like you have all these pieces inside you, dreams, fears, all of it, but none of them ever fit the way they should?" Colton took a slow sip of his drink. "Every day." Lena blinked. That wasn't the answer she expected. "I built a company from scratch," he said, voice quieter now. "I did everything they said I should do. Made the money, sat in boardrooms, wore the suits. But sometimes I wonder if I traded something for it. If I lost the part of myself that used to dream without calculating the risk." He paused, looking at her. "People think I don't feel anything because I don't show it. But that's not true. I feel everything. I just don't let it show." Lena's throat tightened, because suddenly this man didn't seem so untouchable. "I know what that's like," she whispered, "being afraid to let people in. Because what if they don't like what they find?" Colton nodded slowly. "Or worse, what if they do and leave anyway?" The words hung in the air between them, heavier than the chandeliers above. Lena swallowed hard. This wasn't supposed to happen. She had come here to support her best friend, smile for the pictures, and go home to her empty apartment and leftover Thai food. She hadn't planned on being seen, really seen, especially not by someone like him. But now her heart was doing something reckless. She looked over at him. His face was relaxed, but his eyes were focused, not just watching her, but studying her. And not in a cold way. In a way that made her feel like he was trying to memorize something he didn't want to forget. I think, Colton said slowly, that the reason I'm still sitting here isn't because you spilled wine on me. It's because, for the first time in a very long time, I don't feel like I have to pretend. Lena felt a shiver run down her spine. There were so many things she could have said in response, but instead she did the one thing she hadn't allowed herself to do all day. She told the truth. I'm scared, she admitted. Scared that I've worked so hard for things that might never happen, that I'll always be behind, that I'll never be enough. Colton didn't flinch. He just looked at her and said, with surprising gentleness, you already are. She blinked rapidly, willing the tears not to fall. He reached out then, not a bold move, not a flirtation, just his hand brushing hers, barely a touch. But it was enough to say, I see you, enough to say, you're not alone. And Lena finally exhaled. The morning after the wedding, Lena Whitmore sat at her desk at Horizon Design Group, staring at blueprints she had already revised twice. The pages in front of her were crisp, marked with notes and elevations and calculated curves. But her mind was a swirling mess of thoughts she couldn't name and feelings she didn't want to acknowledge. She had spent the night tossing and turning, trying to forget the man with storm gray eyes and a quiet, steady presence that still lingered like a shadow over her shoulder. Colton Reyes. She kept telling herself it was a fluke, a fleeting moment that would vanish with the morning light. He was a billionaire CEO. She was a middle-tier architect fighting to keep her job. Their lives were not meant to overlap. But fate has a funny way of not caring about what's meant to be. Because as Lena walked into the conference room later that day, blueprints tucked under her arm, heart just beginning to settle, there he was, Colton, standing at the head of the table, perfectly composed, tailored suit, that same unreadable gaze. She froze, her breath hitched. The room spun just slightly. Miss Whitmore, he greeted like nothing had happened, like they hadn't shared a conversation that cracked something inside her open. Like he hadn't told her she was enough in a moment when she barely believed it herself. Mr. Reyes, she said tightly, nodding, pretending her knees weren't weak and her palms weren't cold. Their coworkers took seats around them, oblivious to the quiet war happening between their eyes. And when he announced with calm authority that Reyes Capital had officially invested in the firm's most ambitious project, Richmond Tower, and that he would personally oversee its development, Lena felt the floor tilt under her. They would be working together for months, possibly longer, and suddenly the room felt too small. The first week was tolerable. Mostly silence, the kind that hummed beneath the surface of every meeting. Colton was professional, calm, sharp. He never addressed their personal encounter, never alluded to their conversation at the wedding bar. But every time he spoke, every time his voice rolled low across the room like velvet over stone, Lena's chest tightened. And then came the first test. During a design review, Colton questioned one of her structural proposals. Not cruelly, not aggressively, but pointedly. Your solution is cost-effective, he said. But is it timeless? Will it still matter in 20 years? She met his gaze, stunned by the question. Are you saying it's not good enough? I'm saying it feels safe, and I don't believe safe is what you want to build. The room fell silent. Her team looked between them, waiting. And Lena felt her skin flush with equal parts anger and recognition. Because he wasn't wrong, he saw through her, again. She had designed the plan to be safe, budget-friendly, approachable. Because when you're one paycheck away from uncertainty, you stop reaching for masterpieces and start clinging to survival. But now she was being called out, in front of everyone, by the man she was trying desperately not to feel anything for. After the meeting, she cornered him in the hallway. That was uncalled for, she hissed, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Colton didn't flinch. It was honest. You humiliated me. I challenged you. You're strong enough to handle that, aren't you? She swallowed. Why do you do this? Because you're capable of more, and I think you know it. Lena's breath caught in her throat, because the worst part was, he was right. From that moment on, the tension between them grew. He started asking more questions, pushing her thinking, challenging her designs, but never disrespecting her. And the more he pushed, the more she grew. And the more she grew, the more she noticed him, not just as a professional, but as a man. The way he tapped a pen against his notebook when he was deep in thought. The way he remembered small things, like how she liked her coffee or that she always kept a pencil behind her ear. The way his voice softened, just slightly, when he spoke only to her. And yet, she kept her distance, because she had spent years building walls around her heart, and she couldn't afford to let anyone, especially someone like him, in. One night they stayed late finalizing plans. The office was quiet, empty, only the hum of the air conditioning and the shuffle of papers between them. "Why are you still here?" she asked finally, glancing up. Colton didn't look up from his notes. "Because you're here, like." Her pulse jumped. "That's not an answer." He looked at her then slowly. "Isn't it?" Lena stood gathering her things. "I should go." But as she moved toward the door, he said something that made her stop. "You pushed me away, Lena, but I think you know this. Whatever it is, isn't one-sided." She turned slowly, heart pounding. "I don't have time for distractions," she whispered. "And I'm not asking for one," he said. "I'm asking for honesty." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she walked away. The days that followed were a blur. Work, meetings, tension, silence. Every time she passed him in the hallway, she felt the storm brewing under her skin. Every time their hands brushed over a shared blueprint, electricity zipped up her spine. And then one day it all cracked. A meeting ran long. They were the last two in the room. And Lena, exhausted and brittle from too many late nights and too many emotions she couldn't name, let it slip. "I can't do this." Colton looked up, brows furrowed. "Do what?" "This," she said, motioning between them. "Whatever this is, I can't focus. I can't think. Every time I breathe, I wonder if you are watching me. Every time I speak, I wonder if I'm giving too much away. I'm tired, Colton. I'm tired of pretending I don't feel something." He stood slowly, walking around the table until he stood in front of her. "You think I'm not struggling too?" he said quietly. "I'm used to control, to order. But then you walked into that hallway, and you didn't just trip over your dress, Lena. You tripped into my life, and nothing's been the same since." She looked up at him, tears stinging her eyes. "I don't know how to let someone in," she whispered. "You don't have to," he said, stepping closer. "Just let me stand close enough to knock." It had been 3 days since the wedding, 3 days since the hallway collision, the wine spill, the bar conversation. 3 days since Lena Whitmore had tried and failed to forget about Colton Reyes. She'd thrown herself back into work, burying her thoughts beneath stacks of blueprints, late-night revisions, and lukewarm coffee. She convinced herself that their moment, because that's all it had been really, was over, just a spark, just a passing glance, just one of those rare, perfect meetings the universe gives you, not to keep, but to remind you that you're still alive. And she believed it, or tried to, until Monday morning, until her world shifted. The office was unusually quiet that day. There was a tension in the air, one Lena couldn't quite place as she entered the conference room with a folder clutched in one hand and her laptop in the other. Her coworkers murmured softly, glancing toward the front of the room where the firm's director, Oliver Harris, stood reviewing a presentation on the screen. "Morning, Lena," Oliver said without looking up. She gave a distracted nod, finding her usual seat and flipping open her notebook. But then Oliver said something that made her pen freeze mid-scribble. "I'd like everyone to give a warm welcome to our new lead investor for the Richmond Tower project, Mr. Colton Reyes." And the air whooshed out of her lungs. No, that wasn't possible. She looked up, and there he was, standing at the head of the table, composed, confident, as if he hadn't just turned her internal world upside down with a single sentence. Colton met her eyes, and for a single heartbeat, everything else disappeared. The papers, the people, the office walls, they blurred, faded, vanished. There was only the quiet thunder of her heart and the man who had once steadied her when she stumbled, who told her she was enough when she barely believed it herself. Colton gave her the smallest nod, professional, controlled. But his eyes, those storm gray eyes, they flickered with something unspoken. And just like that, Lena knew this wasn't a coincidence. This was fate, interrupted, and now resumed. The meeting continued around her like a dream she couldn't wake from. Oliver spoke about budgets and timelines and design philosophies, but Lena barely heard a word. She was too busy pretending that her hands weren't trembling, that her face wasn't flushed, that her heart wasn't caught somewhere between panic and something else. She stole another glance at Colton, who was now talking through project objectives. He stood with calm confidence, pointing to plans she herself had worked on. The irony nearly made her laugh. He knew. He had to have known. And he hadn't warned her. He hadn't said a word, not a message, not a hint, nothing, which meant he had chosen this. After the meeting, Lena rushed to leave, hoping to disappear into her office before anyone could ask why she was pale and wide-eyed. But she had barely made it 3 steps down the hallway when she heard his voice. Lena. She stopped, closed her eyes, turned. Colton stood just behind her, his hands in his pockets, his posture casual, but his expression unreadable. She tried for a light tone, but it came out thin. Well, you certainly know how to make an entrance. He didn't smile. I didn't plan it this way. She lifted an eyebrow. Didn't you? He stepped closer, but not too close. I found out you were part of the team after the deal was signed, and I decided not to walk away. Why? She asked. Because you enjoy making me uncomfortable? No, he said quietly. Because I wanted to see what happens if we stop pretending nothing happened. Her breath caught. This wasn't a flirtation. This wasn't a game. This was real, immediate, unavoidable. Back in her office, Lena sat at her desk, staring blankly at her computer screen. Her thoughts ran wild. This changed everything. Colton Reyes wasn't just some fleeting connection anymore. He was her investor, her collaborator, her critic, her support, her complication, and he wasn't going anywhere. She felt the burn of it in her chest, not just fear, but exposure. He'd seen a version of her that she usually kept hidden. The insecure one, the one who admitted she was scared, the one who laughed too loudly and wore borrowed shoes to weddings because she couldn't afford her own. And now she'd have to face him every day. How do you hide from someone who already sees you? That afternoon, he knocked on her office door. She looked up, startled, and nodded him in. Colton walked in slowly, a folder in one hand, a familiar silence in the air between them. I didn't come here to make your life harder, he said. I just couldn't walk away. Lena folded her arms. Wait, we had one night, one drink, one moment. That's not a reason. He took a breath. Maybe not, but it was enough. She looked away. You don't understand what you're asking. He tilted his head. Then explain it to me. Lena stood, arms still crossed, her voice shaking slightly. I built walls for a reason. I've kept my head down, done the work, stayed safe. And then her voice cracked. You walk in like a storm and ask me to feel something I've spent years burying. Colton's voice was soft. I didn't mean to be a storm. But you are, she said, tears brimming, and I don't know how to survive that. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he walked to her desk and set the folder down. Then don't survive it alone, he said. Build something with me. Listener, I know your heart is probably holding its breath right now, because this is the moment we all fear and long for. The moment when someone doesn't just knock. They walk through every excuse we've ever built to protect ourselves. So if your heart is with Lena tonight, tell her in the comments, let him stay. Let her know it's okay to choose connection, even when it scares her, because sometimes the right person shows up in the most complicated way. And when they do, you don't always get to choose how it begins, but you do get to choose what happens next. And Lena, she didn't have an answer yet, but she knew one thing. Colton Reyes wasn't just in her project plans. He was in her story now. And somehow she didn't want to write him out. There was something electric in the air at Horizon Design Group, something that hummed just beneath the surface, like the buzz of fluorescent lights or the hush that settles before a storm. And Lena Whitmore could feel it every time she stepped into the office. It wasn't the pressure of deadlines or the towering blueprints that dominated every meeting table. It wasn't even the stress of the Richmond Tower project, which had consumed her waking hours and crept into her dreams. No, what lingered in the air, what followed her like a second shadow, was him. Colton Reyes, the company's lead investor, the man who had once steadied her in a hotel hallway, who had looked at her like she was made of puzzles and poems, and who now sat across from her in meetings with that maddening calm, challenging her in ways that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with what they were both trying desperately to ignore. Every day was a dance of restraint. Lena would enter the conference room and find him already there, reviewing reports with that focused intensity, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened just slightly, a man in control, but just enough to make her wonder what it might feel like if he ever let go. Their conversations were always professional, always polite, but laced with something unspoken. He never crossed a line, not technically, but his words held edges. His glances lingered a second too long, and when their eyes met, it felt like the rest of the room blurred away. And Lena kept telling herself that it meant nothing, that she could handle it, that she could stay in control. But every time he looked at her like that, like she was the most fascinating thing in the room, it chipped away at the walls she'd spent years building brick by brick. It was during a project review one afternoon that the tension finally cracked just enough to let something through. Lena stood at the whiteboard, outlining a proposed structural revision, her voice steady, her pen moving with practiced ease. She had spent the better part of 2 nights refining the plan, making sure every line, every detail was airtight. But when she turned to the group and asked for feedback, Colton spoke first. "It's efficient," he said, arms crossed, brows slightly furrowed. "But it's safe." Lena blinked. Safe isn't always a bad thing when you're building a 40-story tower. Colton leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but pointed. "But we're not just building something to stand. We're building something to last." There it was again, that challenge, that push, not to diminish her work, but to stir something deeper. She felt heat rise in her cheeks, though whether it was frustration or something else, she couldn't say. "If you have suggestions, I'm happy to hear them," she said coolly, forcing her expression to stay neutral. He held her gaze for a long moment, then smiled, just the corner of his mouth lifting. "I just think you hide brilliance behind caution." She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out, because she knew he wasn't talking about the building anymore. After the meeting, as the team filed out, Lena stayed behind to gather her things. She didn't expect him to wait, but when she turned, there he was, still seated, still watching her. "You like doing that, don't you?" she said, trying to keep her tone light, casual. "Doing what?" "Getting under my skin." He stood slowly, adjusting his cuff with casual grace. "I like seeing what you'll do next." "That's not an answer," she said. He stepped closer, not too close, but close enough that she could smell the faint scent of cedar and something darker, something like winter air. "You intrigue me, Lena, and I think you're more used to hiding than being seen." She stiffened. "You don't know anything about me." His voice softened. "Don't I?" She should have walked away. She should have thrown up every professional boundary she had. But instead, she stood there, frozen in place, as something unspoken passed between them like static. And then, with a voice that was barely more than a whisper, she said, "Stop looking at me like that." "Like what?" "Like you already know how this ends." Colton's gaze dropped for just a second, then rose to meet hers again. "I don't. That's why I keep looking." The days that followed were a study in tension. Colton continued to challenge her in meetings, his voice calm, his words laced with layers. "Why this material, Lena? Why that curvature? What are you protecting with this design?" And every time she answered, she could feel herself unraveling just a little more, because she knew what he was doing. He was pushing her not just as a designer, but as a person. And she hated how much she liked it. She hated the way her pulse quickened when she heard his voice outside her office door. She hated the way her breath caught when he stood too close behind her at the drafting table. She hated the way she replayed his words at night, over and over, like a song she couldn't stop humming. And most of all, she hated that he never pushed too far. Because it would have been easier to walk away if he did. It would have been easier to build the wall higher. But instead, he gave her space. Just enough to keep her guessing. Just enough to let her step closer if she wanted to. And slowly, without even meaning to, she did. It happened in small ways. A shared smile over a joke no one else caught. A coffee delivered to her desk just the way she liked it, without asking. A late-night brainstorming session that turned into quiet conversation about everything and nothing. And in those moments, Lena felt herself soften. One evening, they stayed late, again. The rest of the team had gone home and the office lights were dim, casting long shadows across the windows. Lena was reviewing lighting specs when Colton spoke from across the room. "Do you ever stop working?" She didn't look up. "Do you?" "No," she glanced at him. "Why not?" He leaned back in his chair. "Because when I stop, I start thinking. And I don't always like what I find." Her pen stilled. She looked at him fully now, and in his eyes, she saw something she hadn't expected. Loneliness. Real. Quiet. Deep. "I know that feeling," she said softly. And for a moment, there was no teasing, no tension. Just two people, working late, both quietly wondering how they had ended up so alone in a room full of dreams. The first time Colton Reyes asked Lena Whitmore to dinner outside of work, she said no. She said it without looking at him, without hesitating, without even asking where or when. Just a quiet, firm no as she packed up her files and pretended she hadn't noticed the way his eyes softened whenever they were alone. But that night she lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering what would have happened if she'd said yes. It wasn't just the invitation. It was the way he said it, so casual yet deliberate, like he already knew she'd say no, but hoped she wouldn't. "Dinner," he'd said, leaning against her office doorway. Not as co-workers, just two people who can't seem to leave each other alone. And when she didn't answer, he only nodded and said, "Another time." Another time came sooner than she expected. The next week, the office was buzzing with delays and last-minute revisions. Everyone was tense. The air itself felt sharp. Lena had spent 12 hours staring at floor plan revisions until the lines blurred together. She hadn't eaten since breakfast. She was tired, frustrated, and then she looked up, and there he was again. Colton, standing in the doorway with two takeout bags and a look that didn't require permission. "You didn't eat," he said simply. "I'm busy," she replied. "Good. Then you can eat while working." She should have argued. Instead, she cleared a space at the table, and he set the food down like it was a peace offering. They ate in silence at first, just the quiet rustle of wrappers, the soft hum of the city outside the windows. But slowly, like all things between them, it changed. One comment turned into a laugh. One question became a story. And before Lena realized what was happening, she was leaning back in her chair, chopsticks still in hand, smiling at something Colton said about a failed business deal in France involving a goat, a chandelier, and an investor with a fear of heights. "Stop," she said between giggles. "I'm going to choke." Colton only smiled, watching her with that quiet amusement she was coming to know too well. "It's good to hear you laugh." She paused. The words hit somewhere she didn't expect. And maybe he saw it because his expression shifted, gentler now, warmer. And suddenly the laughter faded into something softer. "I like this side of you," he said. Lena looked away. "It's not permanent." "I hope it is," he said, and she didn't know what to say to that. From then on, things began to shift. Not all at once, not in ways anyone else could see. But Lena felt it, in the quiet knock on her door when she worked late, in the coffee placed silently at her desk in the morning, just the way she liked it, no questions asked. In the late-night texts that started about work, but ended with shared playlists, favorite poems, and short confessions. "I don't sleep much," he wrote once. "Too many thoughts." "Me too," she replied. "Too many doubts." It was small, innocent, but real. They started walking after work sometimes, just a few blocks, talking about the project or nothing at all. Lena would keep her arms folded across her chest to keep the warmth in, and maybe the feelings out. But Colton always walked beside her like he had nowhere else to be. Once they stood outside her apartment building, neither one saying goodbye. Colton looked up at the night sky. "Do you ever wonder what it would take to let go?" "Of what?" she asked. He glanced at her. "Whatever's holding you back." She stared at him, unsure if he meant work or something more. And then she said the only thing she could. "Every day." They never kissed. Not then, not yet. But it was there, in the pauses, in the way their hands almost touched when they passed each other in tight spaces, in the way his voice softened when he said her name. Lena told herself it was nothing, that she could keep this line between them clear, that as long as she didn't say it out loud, what she felt, what she feared, it wasn't real. But her heart had already crossed the line, and late at night when she was alone, she hated how much she wanted him to follow. It all came to a head one rainy evening. They had finished a long day of client calls and budget revisions. The city was soaked in silver, rain tapping softly on the windows like a lullaby. Lena was the last one in the office, again, and Colton somehow always managed to be the last one too. She stood by the window, arms wrapped around herself, watching the reflections of red and gold traffic lights bleed across the wet pavement below. "You okay?" he asked from behind her. She nodded, just tired. "Of the project?" She hesitated. "Of pretending." He stepped closer, but not enough to touch. "I know the feeling," he said. And then she turned to him. For the first time, really turned. No sarcasm, no distance, no teasing armor. "Colton," she said quietly, "why are you doing this?" He didn't pretend to misunderstand. He didn't dodge. Instead, he said, "Because I see you, Lena, and I want to keep seeing you." Her voice trembled. "You don't know what you're asking." "I'm not asking," he said gently. "I'm offering." She looked at him, at the man who had been her opponent, her anchor, her unexpected friend. And for a moment, the ache in her chest felt almost bearable. But still, she shook her head. "I can't," she whispered. He stepped back, just slightly, and nodded. But before he left, he said, "You don't have to say yes tonight. Just don't keep saying no out of fear." It started as just another day at the office, but that was a lie, and Lena knew it. From the moment she stepped into the conference room and saw Colton sitting there quiet and still, his expression unreadable, but somehow more human than usual, she felt something shift beneath her ribs, something bracing, something that whispered, "Today won't end the way you think it will." She tried to keep her voice steady during the meeting, forced herself to discuss timelines and design metrics and site logistics while pretending she didn't feel his gaze tracing her profile every time she looked down at her notes. But when it ended, when the room emptied out and she turned to leave, her folder clutched in shaking hands, his voice stopped her. Just one word. "Lena." And it carried more weight than the walls around them could hold. She turned slowly, eyes wary, spine tense. "Yes?" she asked, voice thin, already retreating into armor. "I need to talk to you," he said. "About the project?" she asked, already knowing the answer. "No." The room felt smaller then, the air thinner, and when she crossed her arms and braced herself, it wasn't against him. It was against what she knew was coming. "Colton, if this is another late-night walk disguised as a work debrief, or another dinner where we pretend it's not what it is, I can't—" "It's not," he said gently. "No pretending this time." He stepped closer, not too close, just enough to steady the air between them. And when he spoke again, it was quieter, like a confession, like the kind of truth that had waited long enough. "I'm in love with you, Lena." Her heart stopped. It actually stopped. Because for a split second, all she heard was silence. No air vents, no footfalls in the hallway, just the thunder of her own disbelief. "No," she whispered. "Yes," he said, firmer now. "I've been in love with you for a while. I just didn't know how to say it without scaring you away." She stared at him, lips parted, but her words wouldn't form. "I tried to stay away," he continued. "I told myself it was nothing. I tried to be professional. But then you laughed that night at the bar. Then you cried in your office and tried to hide it. Then you started making buildings sing with your designs again. And I watched it all. And somewhere in the middle of all that watching, I fell." Lena took a slow step back. "I can't," she said. "You're my investor." "Not anymore," he said quietly. She blinked. "What?" "I'm withdrawing," and he said, "I've already begun the process to transfer my shares to another firm. The deal will close by next week. I'm out of the project." You can't be serious," Vishti breathed. "I am." Her voice rose, shaky with disbelief. "Why would you do that? Why would you throw away your investment, your position, your control?" He looked at her, and his gaze softened like melted steel. "Because none of it matters if I lose you." She shook her head, stepping back further, her body torn between running and collapsing. "You're making a mistake." No, he said, taking a step toward her again, slower this time, more careful. I'm making a choice. I didn't ask for this, she said, voice cracking. I never asked you to give up anything. I never wanted to be someone who made you less. You don't make me less, he said, voice thick now. You make me more. And that's when she broke. Her eyes flooded without warning, her hands shaking as she dropped the folder in her arms and pressed them to her chest, as if trying to hold everything in, her heart, her past, her fear. Colton, she whispered, I don't know how to do this. I know, he said, and I'm not asking you to know. I'm just asking you not to run. But she did. She turned and fled the room like something inside her was on fire. Because it was. Because she was. Because she couldn't take one more second of being seen that clearly. Because she had built her whole life around being safe, and Colton Reyes was not safe. He was the opposite. He was lightning and flood and fire. He was the thing that could undo her. And that terrified her more than anything. Lena didn't stop running until she was halfway across the city, soaked in rain she hadn't noticed until she stood outside, her breath ragged, her tears blending with the drizzle streaking her face. She didn't remember calling the car, didn't remember giving the driver directions. All she remembered was the echo of his voice, I'm in love with you, and the way it had shaken her to her bones. She spent the night in her apartment, pacing the small living room like the furniture might rearrange itself to give her the answer she didn't have. She thought about how carefully she had built her life, how long she had fought to prove herself. She had survived heartbreak, loss, being overlooked, underestimated, and she had survived alone. But this wasn't something to survive. This was something to feel, and that was the part she didn't know how to do. She stared at her reflection in the hallway mirror, eyes red, shoulders slumped, jaw clenched, and whispered to herself, I don't want to lose him. And as soon as she said it, she broke again. Because it was true. Because she already knew. She loved him too. The next morning, the sun rose soft and gold across the city skyline, and Lena stood in front of the Reyes Capitol office building like she didn't remember how to walk. She hadn't slept. Her clothes were wrinkled. Her hair was a mess. But none of that mattered. She just needed to see him. When the elevator doors opened and she stepped into the 32nd floor, the receptionist barely had time to greet her before Lena was moving past her. Down the hallway, toward the office she had once said she'd never enter outside of work. And there he was, Colton, standing behind his desk, papers in his hands, looking like the same man who had changed everything with one sentence. He looked up, saw her, and something shifted in his expression, hope flickering like a candle that hadn't gone out. Lena stepped into the office, closed the door behind her, and for a long moment she said nothing. Then, I'm sorry I ran. He nodded slowly. You weren't ready. I still might not be, she said, but I don't want to lose you either. He took a step toward her, and she didn't back away this time. I'm scared, she whispered. So am I, he said. But I'd rather be scared with you than safe without you. Tears filled her eyes again. I don't know how to be with someone who sees everything. You don't have to, he said. Just let me see it. I'll take care of the rest. She didn't answer. She just walked into his arms. And this time, she didn't run. It was late, almost midnight, when the knock came and Lena Whitmore nearly didn't answer. She was sitting on her couch in an oversized sweater, legs curled beneath her, a blanket clutched to her chest like a shield against the ache she hadn't been able to name all day. The apartment was dark, save for the soft glow of a lamp in the corner, and the only sound was the quiet hum of her overworked thoughts. She had spent the evening staring at her phone, reading the last message Colton had sent. I need to see you. 4 words, simple, heavy, and she hadn't replied. Because she was scared. Because she didn't know if she was strong enough to let herself want something she couldn't control. But now, standing on the other side of her door, he was here. She knew it before she even opened it. She knew it by the way her heartbeat shifted, the way the air in the room changed. She stood slowly, heart hammering in her chest, and crossed the room with steps that felt like walking across thin ice. When she opened the door, there he was, Colton Reyes, hands in his coat pockets, tie gone, shirt slightly wrinkled, hair tousled, But it wasn't how he looked that stopped her. It was his face, his eyes. He looked tired, but not from work, from holding back, from waiting, from caring more than he knew how to say. And when he spoke, his voice wasn't smooth or controlled. It was raw, quiet, honest. "I love you, Lena," he said. Just like that, no preamble, no buildup, no explanation. Just truth, delivered in a single sentence that cracked her wide open. Her breath caught, her hand tightened on the edge of the door, and before she could respond, before she could even begin to form a thought, he kept going. "I know I should have said it sooner. I know I've probably ruined every clean line we've drawn between us, and maybe I'm showing up too late. And maybe I don't have the right to say this after how long you've been trying to stay away. But I can't keep pretending that this isn't real, that what I feel for you is something I can ignore." He paused just long enough for her eyes to fill with tears. "Lena, I see you, not just the version of you that shows up to meetings with perfect posture and steady words. I see the woman who stays late because she doesn't want to go home to silence. I see the one who laughs harder than she means to because she's surprised she can still laugh at all. I see the fighter, the dreamer, the one who doesn't know how much light she carries because she's spent so long dimming it just to survive." His voice broke a little. "And I love all of it. Not in pieces, not in theory. I love you." And that's when she cried. Not loud sobs, not dramatic, cinematic tears, just silent ones, slipping down her cheeks while her mouth stayed frozen and her body stayed still. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't prepared for the moment when the man she had tried so hard not to need would show up at her door and offer her the one thing she had stopped believing she deserved, a place to rest her heart. Colton took a small step closer, voice barely above a whisper now. "You don't have to say anything. I just needed you to know. And if you tell me to walk away, I will. I'll leave, and I won't bother you again. But I needed to be brave for once. I needed to stop waiting for the right time and just tell you. Because the truth is, Lena, I think I've been waiting for you long before we ever met." She let out a sound then, not quite a sob, but something softer, something like surrender. And she stepped back, not away from him, but into the space behind the door. She opened it wider, just enough to let him in. Not just into her apartment, but into the quiet, trembling, terrified place in her chest, where hope had been knocking for months. He stepped inside slowly, not saying a word. She closed the door behind him and turned around, eyes shining with the kind of emotion that doesn't need translation. "You know," she said quietly, "I tried so hard not to feel this." He nodded. "I know. I told myself it wasn't smart, that it wouldn't work, that people like us don't get happy endings." "Maybe not," he said, "but maybe we get a beginning." She looked up at him, her throat tight. "What if I'm still scared?" "Then be scared," he said. "But let me stand beside you while you are." And that's when she collapsed into him, arms around his waist, face pressed to his chest, all the resistance melting into something softer, something braver, something finally free. He wrapped his arms around her like he'd been waiting his whole life for the chance. And in that embrace, in the hush of that moment, something shifted. The past loosened its grip. The fear didn't vanish, but it lost its power. And for the first time in years, Lena Whitmore allowed herself to be held and to hold back. They sat on the couch for a long time, saying nothing, just sitting close, fingers intertwined, her head on his shoulder, her heart finally quiet. She didn't know what came next. They hadn't talked about labels or expectations or how they'd explain this to the team at work. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that she had stopped running, that he had stopped waiting, that they had found each other, not in grand moments, but in small ones, in shared silences, in open doors, in words that took too long to say, but arrived right on time. Later, as they stood in the doorway and Colton pulled on his coat to leave, Lena touched his arm and said, "I don't want you to go." He smiled gently. "Then say it." Her eyes softened. "Stay." And he did, not just for the night, but for whatever came next, the storms, the quiet, the rebuilding, the real. It didn't happen all at once, not the peace, not the stillness, not the certainty that Lena Whitmore had finally stepped into a chapter of her life that wasn't about surviving, but about living. It came slowly, quietly, like the soft bloom of dawn after a long, sleepless night. She and Colton didn't wake up one day suddenly knowing how to be a perfect couple. They fumbled, they learned, they listened. They disagreed about countertops and travel plans and whether or not it was okay to keep cereal in the fridge. But beneath all of it, beneath the routines they slowly built and the rhythms they grew into, there was something unshakable, a trust that hadn't existed before, a knowing that said, I choose you, even on the hard days, especially on the hard days. Colton, once the cold, calculating CEO known for keeping emotions under tight control, softened in ways only Lena ever saw. He became the man who left notes in her coat pocket on rainy mornings, who kept flowers on her desk on deadline days, who paused his meetings just to text her, thinking of you. And Lena, she stopped apologizing for the space she took up in the world. She began to speak without shrinking, laugh without permission, design without fear. She stopped waiting to be loved and finally accepted that she already was. They navigated the merging of their lives carefully, balancing work and love with honesty, boundaries, and laughter. People whispered, of course. That's how workplaces are. But Lena stopped caring what they thought, because what they had wasn't gossip, it was gold. And every glance across the room, every subtle hand squeeze under the conference table, every late night walk home, holding coffee instead of fear, it all meant something. They began to travel, little by little. Nothing extravagant at first. Weekend drives, small towns, bookstores, and bakeries. Colton said he'd seen the world through spreadsheets. Lena taught him how to see it through stories. One evening in a small coastal town with lanterns glowing across the boardwalk and the scent of salt and cinnamon in the air, Colton pulled her aside and said, let's stop pretending we don't know where this is headed. Lena raised an eyebrow, teasing. Oh, and where's that? Colton smiled, eyes warm. Forever. She didn't answer with words, just leaned in and kissed him, because she knew too. The proposal wasn't flashy. There were no photographers hiding in the bushes, no champagne towers or skywritten messages. It was late autumn. The leaves had turned gold, and they were back in the city where it all started. Colton had taken Lena out for dinner, not one of those high-rise rooftop restaurants, but a quiet bistro where the chairs didn't match and the food tasted like someone's grandmother made it from scratch. They ate slowly, sharing stories and laughing between bites. And when they walked home arm in arm, their breath visible in the crisp air, he stopped at the corner of her favorite bookstore and looked at her like he had that night so long ago in the ballroom, like she was the most extraordinary thing he had ever seen. Lena, he said softly, reaching into his coat pocket, you once told me you were afraid to be loved. She blinked, already emotional. And now? Now, he said, opening the small velvet box, I hope you're ready to spend the rest of your life being loved with every part of me. Lena didn't cry right away. She smiled first. That kind of smile that happens when the soul exhales. And then, through tears and laughter and shaking hands, she said yes. Not just to the ring, not just to the man, but to the life, the one she never thought she was allowed to want. They planned the wedding together, simple, elegant, honest. No games, no performances, just love. The day of the ceremony, the sky was a soft blue-gray, the kind of sky that promises peace. Lena walked down the aisle in a gown that shimmered with grace, every step steady, every breath filled with quiet joy. Colton stood at the altar in a dark suit, his eyes never leaving her. And when their hands met, when the vows were said and the rings were exchanged, there wasn't a single person in the room who didn't feel it, that they weren't just witnessing a wedding. They were witnessing a home being built, in the middle of the world, between two hearts that had been strangers, then skeptics, then something sacred. When they kissed, the room erupted. But for Lena and Colton, the moment didn't explode. It settled, like the last puzzle piece finally falling into place. So, dear listener, what can we take from Lena and Colton's story? What lesson is folded into their long, winding journey? Maybe it's this. Don't close your heart just because someone once walked out. Don't bury your softness to survive in a hard world. And don't assume that love must be loud to be real. Sometimes it's quiet, patient, persistent. It waits on the other side of your fear and asks gently, are you ready now? And when you are, it doesn't run. Today, Lena and Colton are still writing their story, one sunrise at a time. Some days are easy, some are heavy, but they walk through each one hand in hand. They've built a home that's filled with light and laughter, but also space. Space to grow, to be quiet, to feel. And maybe that's the most beautiful part, that they didn't find perfection. They found something real, something they chose, every day, with open hearts and open doors. If this story touched your heart, if you believe in love that heals, love that grows, love that waits, please leave a comment below. Just write, Lena, you found your forever. Because sometimes the bravest thing we can do for each other is remind each other that it's still possible. And don't forget to tap the like button if you've ever loved someone enough to let your guard down. If you'd like more stories like this, stories that whisper to the heart and remind us we're never too far from a new beginning, subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell. Because here we don't just tell stories, we live them together. Until next time, dear friend, take care of your heart and never stop believing in love that stays.